Israel will not agree to any kind of pause in its war against Hamas until that pause includes the release of hostages, sources familiar with Antony Blinken's talks in Israel told CNN just this morning. Secretary of State Blinken touched down in Tel Aviv yesterday, where he met with President Herzog and Bibi Netanyahu to advocate for brief pauses in Israel's offensive for the passing of humanitarian aid and the release of hostages. The visit, of course, was also a show of U.S. support for Israel's continuing retaliation to Hamas's attacks on October 7th. Here's Blinken's speech from this morning.
We believe that each of these efforts would be facilitated by humanitarian pauses, by arrangements on the ground that increase security for civilians and permit the more effective and sustained delivery of humanitarian assistance. That was an important area of discussion today with Israeli leaders. How, when, and where these can be implemented, what work needs to happen, and what understandings must be reached. Now, we recognize this would take time to prepare and coordinate as well with international partners. A number of legitimate questions were raised in our discussions today, including how to use any period of pause to maximize the flow of humanitarian assistance, how to connect a pause to the release of hostages, how to ensure that Hamas doesn't use these pauses or arrangements to its own advantage. These are issues that we need to tackle urgently, and we believe they can be solved.
Meanwhile, Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah, broke his silence on the war in Gaza during a televised address this morning in Lebanon. He blamed the West, saying, quote, "The United States is controlling the war in Gaza, and it is the United States that must pay the price for the crimes perpetrated by the Israelis in Gaza and by the Americans in Iraq and elsewhere."
Israeli troops, meanwhile, continue their march deeper into Palestine, successfully surrounding Gaza City yesterday, per the Palestinian Health Ministry. The number of Gazans killed in the past 3 weeks of fighting now nears 10,000.
Joining us now to discuss these latest developments is Jonathan Spire, author, Middle East analyst, and director of research at Middle East Forum. Jonathan, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
So you're based in Jerusalem. Can you give us a sort of lay of the land of what things are like right now? I talked to some sources the other day who said that at this point it seems most of the concern in terms of safety for the Israelis comes from potential rocket attacks. But I'd love for you to give us an update on the on-the-ground situation.
Yes, I think with regard to the whole country, except for the areas immediately on the northern border and immediately around the Gaza Strip, the main security concern at the present time is the possibility of rocket attacks, missile attacks coming out of Gaza towards Israeli urban centers. So the urban centers of central Israel, that's to say Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, of course, most significantly, have been subject to sirens, to warnings and so on. But having said that, I would say that, 4 weeks into this now, in a familiar way, there is a kind of routine of war settling into the country now. Israelis are familiar with periods of conflict, although this is certainly a very, very intense one. But there is then a certain, life has to be lived. And so a certain type of normality after the initial deep shock, I think, which came to the country after October 7th, is now starting to settle in. Shops are opening again, businesses are opening again, people are out on the streets again, and there is that sense, I think, of a certain normality returning.
So we have Antony Blinken saying that now he would support a humanitarian pause, a ceasefire, so that aid can get into Gaza. But we had the United States also use their veto power in the Security Council, the lone vote vetoing a humanitarian pause in Gaza. Now, they say that they would like for the aid to come in. We've had trucks come in. They were used to getting 500 trucks a day about in Gaza. Do you think that this could be a strategy by the Israelis and the United States working with them to give a limited amount of aid into Gaza to cause some internal strife, to, cause people to fight over the limited resources that they have in the Gaza Strip?
An interesting question. I think what it's important to understand right now is that Israel regards itself as at war with Hamas-controlled Gaza, two entities at war with one another. It is not and has not generally in history been a norm or an expectation that when one country is at war with another, that country is nevertheless responsible for making sure that the civilians or indeed anybody within the enemy country is fed and watered and so on. That's not a norm, and I think that's not a norm that Israel wishes to accept. it's particularly, I think, reluctant to accept it when we take into account the fact that Hamas has been ruling Gaza, of course, since 2007, has received an enormous amount of international aid, and as it is now clear, has concentrated on building an enormous tunnel network in order to make war against Israel. An interview on October 27th, I think it was, of Hamas leader Musa Abu Marzouk with Russia Today. In that interview, Abu Marzouk said that only the Hamas people are allowed into the tunnels. The job of looking after the civilians is for the UN and what he called the occupation, by which he meant Israel. That's a kind of division of functions which Hamas is apparently happy with. Israel is not. Israel does not regard itself as primarily responsible for the situation within Gaza. Israel is at war with Gaza. It's in Gaza to destroy Hamas governance in that area, and that, I think, is front and center of Israel's concerns at the present time.
The leader of Hamas invoked the United States in his criticism of what Israel has been doing. And I just wonder your opinion on that strategy, because there is a very robust debate in the United States right now of both how much aid should be given to Israel and whether the United States should get involved militarily. Is it wise for the leader of Hamas to try to intentionally bring the U.S. into this conflict and risk bringing the weight of the U.S. military down on him?
I think you're referring actually to the leader of Hezbollah, to Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah.
My apologies.
Sure, no, it's fine. Yes, so with regard to his speech that he just gave earlier today in Beirut, yes, he did seek, of course, to apportion the center of the blame to the United States. I think there's an element, of course, of rhetoric which we should always be aware of with Nasrallah's sometimes quite long and speeches. And we need to look for the key few sentences which show us the real content. And my own sense, at least with regard to that speech, is that yes, he did talk about the United States. He described Israel as the tool of the United States and so on. But this is Nasrallah using, I think, rhetoric. The things that really mattered were, I think, two things. One was that he expressed that his organization and Iran were not aware of the plans for the carrying out of the October 7th attack or atrocity carried out by Hamas. And he said it was, a Palestinian achievement as he regards it. That's very important, I think, because what I think he was actually saying with that. And the second thing was, he said, people say Hezbollah should enter the war, but actually we've been in the war since October 8th, referring to the limited attacks that they're carrying out. Both those two statements, I think, indicated that despite the rhetoric, actually what Nasrallah was saying in Beirut was a message to Hamas saying, listen, guys, you're actually probably on your own in this. We precisely don't want to bring down the possible responses of either the United States military, in the shape of the USS Gerald Ford right now in the Mediterranean, or indeed the Israeli military, which has made very clear that if Hezbollah does enter the war, there will be a very, very serious response from Israel's part. And I think Nasrallah's speech, if you condense it down from the rhetoric to the meaning, what he was actually saying could have been said in just a few words. He was saying to Hamas, listen, guys, you're probably on your own in this.
Jonathan Spire, thank you so much for joining us and breaking this down today.
Thanks very much.